We also have another strategy to load related entities, and that's called explicit loading. With this strategy, similar to eager loading, we tell Entity Framework exactly what should be loaded ahead of time. But the difference between explicit loading and eager loading is that with eager loading, Entity Framework will join the related tables and query all the data in one round trip. Whereas with eager loading, there will be multiple queries depending on the number of explicit loads. So let me show you explicit loading in action. So in this code here, first we get an author with ID 1. And note that we're using the include method to eager load the author and his courses. Next, we iterate over the courses for this author and display them on the console. In the last lecture, I told you that in situations where you have too many includes, your queries end up being really bulky. In such cases, if you still need to load all these objects ahead of time, you can use explicit loading. So I'm going to modify this code to use explicit loading instead of eager loading. First, I'm going to get rid of this include here. And this is going to simplify my query because Entity Framework is not going to join the authors table with the courses table. We only get an author with ID 1. Now we need to explicitly load the courses for this author. And this is what we call explicit loading. There are two ways to do explicit loading. First, I'm going to show you the MSDN way, which I personally don't like, and I will show you why. And then I'm going to present my way of explicit loading. So here's the MSDN way. We start with context. Now here we need to use the entry method and pass that author object here. So this method returns a DB entry object for that author. Next, we need to use the collection method. And here we use a lambda expression to reference the courses collection of that author. So A goes to a.courses. And finally, we call the load method. Now, one thing I personally don't like about this approach is you need to remember more of the API of DB context. For example, you need to remember this entry and collection method here. There are also a couple more methods, but there is another reason that I don't like this approach. And that reason is this only works for single entries. So here we have only one author object. But if my query, the original query here, returned a list of authors, I could not use this approach here. So let me show you my way of doing explicit loading. In this case, first we got the author. Now we want to write a query to get all courses for that author. How do we do it? You already know that. So context.courses.where C goes to C.author ID equals author, that author object here, .id. So nothing new so far. And then we call the load method. So the only thing you need to remember is this load method here, nothing else. Now with either MSDN way or my way, what happens here is we're going to have two queries to the database. The first query is going to get an author with ID 1, and then the second query is going to get all courses for that author. So let me run this application and show you these queries in SQL Profiler. Okay, let's go to SQL Profiler. All right, look. Here's the first query. So select ID and name from authors, where ID is 1. And here's the second query. So we have a select from courses table, where author ID is this parameter, which is set to 1, which is the ID of our author. So with explicit loading, we can simplify a complex query that is a result of too many includes and too much eager loading. Of course, we're going to end up with multiple round trips to the database, but sometimes this can be more efficient than running a huge query on the database. But explicit loading also has another benefit. We can apply filters to the related objects. So back here in Visual Studio, imagine we want to get this author and only his free courses. If we use eager loading for that, we're going to load all courses for this author, but we're only interested in the free ones. Now, in a lot of cases, this is not a big issue, but if you're working on a performance critical application with a huge database and quite a few number of concurrent users, this is not an efficient way to load an author and his free courses. So with explicit loading, we can apply filter. Now with MSTN way, you need to call the query method here to get access to the query object and then apply the filter. So courses that are free. So as you see, again, you need to remember more of the API. This approach, for my personal taste, is too noisy. With my approach, all you have to do is apply the filter here. So what I want you to take away from this lecture is only this load method here. When you need to use explicit loading, write your queries like the way you have always done, and finally call the load method. I demonstrated the MSTN way just in case you see some tutorials, you don't get a surprise. But prefer to use the second approach because it's simpler and it's more flexible. Let me show you why. I'm going to clean up all this code here and start from a new example. So imagine we want to get all authors and their free courses. So to get all authors, context.authors.toList. Now to get the free courses for these authors, we cannot use the MSTN approach. Because if I call context.entry, I cannot pass this authors object here. Because the entry method is used to reference only a single entry, a single object. Now let's try this with my approach. So we want to get the free courses for all these authors. So context.courses.where C goes to. Now let me show you a technique to select multiple courses by ID. The way we do this in SQL is something like this. Let me show you how to do the same thing in LINQ. So back here, first I'm going to select all author IDs. So from this authors object, which is currently in memory, I'm going to select only the ID of these authors. And this select method now returns an IEnumerable of integers. So author IDs, look at the type, IEnumerable of t, where t is an int32. Now back to this query. So we are filtering courses where C goes to author IDs that contains C dot author ID. So when Entity Framework runs this, it will use the in operator to select multiple courses. Okay, now the second part of our filter. Only courses that are free. And finally, we call the load method. And that brings us to the end of this lecture. I hope you enjoyed this lecture and thank you for watching.